Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on medieval church history. We concluded the 10th century last time, so now we begin with the 11th century. Pope 140, his baptismal name was Giovanni Siccio, Siccio. He was elected by what we're calling the Italian faction, in the sense that they wanted Italy to be run by them instead of either by the Byzantine Greeks or the Germans or the French. So he kept his baptismal name Giovanni. So this is Pope John the 17th. Rome was still in the hands of Giovanni II Crescentius, who was functionally dictator of Rome. John the 17th was murdered 6 months after his election on the 6th of November, 1003 AD. The House Crescentii continued its hegemony over the Holy See. The Roman clergy therefore elected the candidate approved by the Crescentii Patriarch. This man was serving as the cardinal priest of St. Peter. His baptismal name was also Giovanni. This was Giovanni Fasano. He also kept his baptismal name as Pope 141, reigning under the title John the 18th. He lasted for 5 years and 7 months. Meanwhile, seeing what's going on in the rest of the church, to catch up with Germany. Previously, the Holy Roman Emperor, Otto III, died on the 23rd of January, 1002, without a surviving legitimate son. His nearest male heir was a cousin, a grandson of Otto the Great's uncle, who was the first Duke of Bavaria in southern Germany under the Saxon dynasty. This man became Saint Henry, eventually became saint. Henry Heinrich II is how he was as King of Germany and Holy Roman Emperor, but he subsequently was canonized as saint. The papal legate for Germany, the Archbishop of Mainz, whose name was Willigis, crowned him in Mainz on the 7th of June, 1002. Henry II, would turn out to be the last member of the Saxon dynasty, or the dynasty of Otto the Great. He was later canonized in 1146 by Pope Blessed Eugenius III. So far, the only German monarch to be canonized. St. Henry did cross the Alps into northern Italy in an attempt to deliver the Holy See from the thraldom to the House Crescentii, but his military force was not strong enough to lay siege to the city of Rome, which is what it would have been necessary to oust the Crescentii. So, for the moment, Henry had to be content with being crowned Rex Italicum, the King of Italy, at Pavia instead of Rome, and the ceremony was presided over by the Archbishop of Milan rather than the Pope. And the ceremony took place on the 15th of May, 1004. The only action of Pope John XVIII's personal initiative, which was of long-term importance, was his creation of the Diocese of Bomberg in 1007. This is a town in Bavaria, southern Germany, in the region of where St. Henry had been Duke. This move began the ecclesiastical reorganization of southern Germany, which still remains the most Catholic part of Germany and has the most Catholic German speakers outside of Austria. I say ecclesiastical reorganization because earlier in the Merovingian section, and especially in the Carolingian section, we saw the earlier ecclesiastical organization, an earlier ecclesiastical reorganization of Austria and southern Germany after the fall of the empire. As we were converting the successor king, we converted the Merovingians, and then the Carolingians, they supported the church, so the organization began there. But then after the Carolingians fell, there were the civil wars, so all that fell apart, so we had to do it again. And this is it. This is how we start again. And St. Henry would eventually be buried in the cathedral of this Diocese of Bomberg. At this point in church history, we meet the first doctor of the church born after the year 1000, St. Peter Damien. Pope Benedict XVI described St. Peter Damien in this way, his importance in this way, with these words. Quote, one of the most significant figures of the 11th century, St. Peter Damien, a monk, a lover of solitude, and at the same time, a fearless man of the church, committed personally to the task of reform initiated by the popes of the time. He was born in Ravenna in 1007 into a noble family, but in straitened circumstances. He was left an orphan, and his childhood was not exempt from hardships and suffering. Although his sister, Rosalinda, tried to be a mother to him, and his elder brother Damien adopted him as his son. For this reason, he was to be called Piero di Damiano, or Pier Damiani, or Peter Damien. He was educated first at Faenza, and then at Parma, where already at the age of 25, we find him involved in teaching. As well as a good grounding in the field of law, he acquired a refined expertise in the art of writing, the ars scribendi, and thanks to his knowledge of the great Latin classics, became one of the most accomplished Latinists of his time, and one of the greatest writers of medieval Latin. He distinguished himself in the widest range of literary forms, from letters to sermons, from hagiographies to prayers, from poems to epigrams. His sensitivity to beauty led him to poetic contemplation of the world. Peter Damien conceived of the universe as a never-ending parable and a sequence of symbols on which to base the interpretation of inner life and divine and supernatural reality. In this perspective, in about the year 1034, contemplation of the absolute of God impelled him gradually to detach himself from the world and from its transient realities, and to withdraw to the monastery of Fonte Avellana. It had been founded only a few decades earlier, but was already celebrated for its austerity. For the monk's edification, he wrote the life of the founder of that monastery, St. Romuald of Ravenna, and at the same time strove to deepen their spirituality, expounding on his ideal of eremitic monasticism. Excuse me a moment. Sorry about that. Expounding his ideal of eremitic monasticism. One detail should be immediately emphasized. The hermitage of Fonta Alevana was dedicated to the Holy Cross, and the cross was the Christian mystery that was to fascinate Peter Damien more than all the others. In his words, those who do not love the cross of Christ do not love Christ. And he described himself as Peter, servant of the servants of the cross of Christ. This great monk compiled a rule for eremitical life in which he heavily stressed the rigor of the hermit. In the silence of the cloister, the monk is called to spend a life of prayer by day and by night with prolonged and strict fasting. He must put into practice generous brotherly charity and ever prompt and willing obedience to the prior. In study and in the daily meditation of sacred scripture, Peter Damien discovered the mystical meaning of the Word of God, finding in it nourishment for his spiritual life. In this regard, he described the hermit's cell, meaning the room, the hermit's room, as the parlor in which God converses with men. For him, living as a hermit was the peak of Christian existence, the loftiest of the states of life, because the monk, now free from the bonds of worldly life and of his own self, receives a dowry from the Holy Spirit, and his happy soul is united with its heavenly spouse. St. Peter Damien, who was essentially a man of prayer, meditation, and contemplation, was also a fine theologian. His reflection on various doctrinal themes led him to important conclusions for life. His meditation on the figure of Christ is significantly reflected in practical life, since the whole of Scripture is centered on him. The Jews, St. Peter noted, through the pages of sacred Scripture, bore Christ on their shoulders, as it were. Therefore, Christ, he added, must be the center of the monk's life. May Christ be heard in our language. May Christ be seen in our life. May he be perceived in our hearts. In Letter 28, which is a brilliant ecclesiological treatise, Peter Damien develops a profound theology of the Church as communion. Christ's Church, he wrote, is united by the bond of charity to the point that just as she has many members, so is she mystically, entirely contained in a single member, in such a way that the whole universal Church is rightly called the one bride of Christ in the singular, and each chosen soul through the sacramental mystery is considered fully Church. However, the ideal image of Holy Church, illustrated by Peter Damien, does not correspond, as he knew well, to the reality of his time. For this reason, he did not fear to denounce the state of corruption that existed in the monasteries and among the clergy, because above all, of the practice of the conferral by the lay authorities of ecclesiastical offices. Various bishops and abbots were behaving as the rulers of their subjects rather than as pastors of souls. Their moral life frequently left much to be desired. So that's Pope Benedict referring to the feudalism problem, which we've talked about many, many times, and we will continue to talk about it because it affected the Church for so long. So back to Benedict on Damien. For this reason, in 1057, Peter Damien left his monastery with great reluctance and sorrow, and accepted, unwillingly, his appointment as Cardinal Bishop of Ostia. Ostia was the port of Rome at the time. So it was that he entered fully into collaboration with the popes in the difficult task of church reform. He saw that to make his own contribution of helping in the work of the Church's renewal, contemplation did not suffice. He thus relinquished the beauty of the hermitage and courageously undertook numerous journeys and missions. Because of his love for monastic life, 10 years later, in 1067, he obtained permission to return to Fonta Elevana and resign from the Diocese of Ostia. However, the tranquility he had longed for did not last long. 2 years later, he was sent to Frankfurt in an endeavor to prevent the divorce of Henry IV from his wife Bertha. And again, 2 years later, in 1071, he went to Monte Cassino for the consecration of the Abbey Church, and at the beginning of 1072 to Ravenna to re-establish peace with the local archbishop, who had supported the anti-pope bringing interdiction upon the city. And we'll meet all of these when we go back to the papal chronology. On the journey home to his hermitage, an unexpected illness obliged him to stop at the Benedictine monastery of Santa Maria Vecchia in Fensta, where he died in the night between the 22nd and 23rd of February, 1072. St. Peter Damien was a monk through and through, with forms of austerity, which to us today might seem excessive. Yet, in that way, he made monastic life an eloquent testimony of God's primacy and an appeal to all to walk towards holiness, free from any compromise with evil. He spent himself with lucid consistency and great severity for the reform of the church of his time. He gave all his spiritual and physical energies to Christ and to the church, but always remained, as he liked to describe himself, Peter, the lowliest servant of the monks. Okay, so high praise by Pope Benedict, seeing that Peter Damien is still, as the doctor of the church, still a significant figure within the whole tapestry of the unfolding of church history. So, as Benedict said, Peter Damien was born in 1007, baptized Piero during the reign of Pope John XVIII, which is why I'm mentioning it now. Orphaned at an early age. Now, Benedict, this is a quote from an address, so he couldn't go into all the detail, but Peter Damien spent his childhood, or significant parts of it, suffering abuse. Frankly, from a relative, and he nearly died of that abuse. He took comfort from the suffering and torture, frankly, that endured by Christ, also unjust, undeserved, and made a connection in his mind, while still very young, between enduring suffering and growing in holiness. A biblical passage that stayed with him, that he encountered it early in life, but really stayed with him and shaped his character in the kind of way that Pope Benedict described in general terms, is Matthew chapter 16, verses 24 and 25. Quote, "Then Jesus said to his disciples, 'Whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it.'" Enduring suffering is an intrinsically isolating experience because it overwhelms the senses until there's nothing in the person's awareness but pain. At that moment, in St. Peter's view, it is possible to connect with Christ in a way not otherwise possible by concentrating on the isolation that Jesus felt while he was enduring his own suffering, abandoned. The isolation of the Christian sufferer is redeemed in the same way that the suffering of Christ was, by connecting with God in the moment of isolation created by the suffering. As Peter Damien developed this line of reasoning, he concluded that it is not possible to focus completely on God except during suffering, because it renders the distractions of the outside world invisible, as all other sense input is drowned in misery. The culmination of this line of reasoning was St. Peter's promotion of the discipline, as it was called, as a personal spiritual practice. This meant whipping, flogging, flagellation. And this could be coupled with other forms of sleep deprivation, which is the night watch, the vigil, as they would say, keeping vigil. That's what that meant then, is staying up all night, not sleeping. But staying up, in prayer, not fasting, starvation level fasting, wearing painful garments such as a hair shirt. His goal was to induce, through mortification, a spiritual state of isolation from the world of exterior sense input, in order to reach that state of inner isolation, which can then be directed wholly toward God. A couple of examples. He considered that if a sin merited a year of penance, which that happened, and penance would be wearing the hair shirt, and you show up to mass, but in the garb of a penitent, with ashes and the hair shirt, and you would not receive communion. That's part of your punishment, and then you would ask everyone to pray for you, but in lieu of that, Peter Damien said, receiving 3,000 lashes would suffice as a substitute penance. He once gave a penance to a bishop. The penance was reciting the entire book of Psalms 3 times and washing the feet of 12 beggars and giving each a coin from his personal funds. And so what was the bishop's sin? The bishop's sin was playing chess, playing a game. There was nothing intrinsically wrong about chess. It's that for Peter the sin was just playing a game, which is, from his view, frivolous, a waste of time. Any game is frivolous and is a waste of time. So this practice of asceticism, mortification, can of course be taken too far. St. Peter himself often harmed his health by such practices. However, the importance he eventually attained in the church as Cardinal Bishop of Austria meant that his spiritual views were given a wider circulation than would otherwise have been the case if he had just remained in a monastery. And these views form one stream of medieval piety, of medieval spirituality. Catholic spiritual thought does have a highly developed body of thought on asceticism and mortification. Now, these have been present since the patristic period. So the seminarians, we covered this last year. So St. Peter Damien's writings and example can be seen in the broader context as a revival of an ancient spiritual practice that had fallen aside in the generations of anarchy. So to refresh our memories, and for those who may not have taken the patristic course with me, the term asceticism, A-S-C-E-T-I-C-I-S-M, is derived from a Greek word ascesis, meaning practice, simply practice. And originally, like in classical Greek, it would refer to specifically to training of a soldier, training of an athlete. Scriptural foundation for use of this in a Christian context can be found in St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 9, verse 25, which reads, quote, "Every athlete exercises discipline in every way. They do it to win a perishable crown, but we an imperishable one." So the perishable crown was in the Greco-Roman world, victors would have a laurel wreath or some other kind of leaf, but it would be some kind of crown that would be, like in the Olympics now they do the medal. Well, then in the antiquity they wouldn't have. It would have been a crown. But at St. Paul's, it's leaves, so obviously it's perishable. Whereas the Christian does it for an imperishable crown, salvation, immortality. The current teaching of the Church on the matter of asceticism is summarized in the Catechism number. Remember, this is not page numbers, this is paragraph numbers. So it's the same regardless of the edition you use. Number 1734. Quote, freedom makes man responsible for his acts to the extent that they are voluntary. Progress in virtue, knowledge of the good, and ascesis enhance the mastery of the will over its actions. The other term we used, and that Pope Benedict used in his description, is the term mortification. That's from a Latin word. Latin, and a verb in its infinitive form, mortificare, means to kill. Meaning, in the spiritual sense, to kill to kill sin, to kill sinful impulses, temptations, and disordered thoughts and practices. Scriptural foundation for this can be found in St. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 8, verses 12 and 13. Quote, consequently, my brothers, we are not debtors to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. So put to death, mortificare. Well, he wrote it in Greek, but in the Latin it would be from that verb, mortificare, to kill. So put to death the deeds of the flesh, meaning the temptations of the flesh, the distractions, and the sins that it can lead to. The current teaching of the Church on mortification is summarized in the Catechism, number 2015. Quote, the way of perfection passes by way of the cross. There is no holiness without renunciation and spiritual battle. Spiritual progress entails the ascesis and mortification that gradually lead to living in the peace and joy of the Beatitudes. Okay, so St. Peter's view of the world was set by the time he was rescued from his torturous childhood by a relative who was a priest. This was the Father Damiano, and out of gratitude to him, Peter added his name to his own, as Pope Benedict referred to in what I read earlier, Peter Damien. St. Peter was sent initially to a Cluny Reformed abbey in Parma, Italy, where he received a fine education and was exposed to the best liturgy available at the time. But eventually, as his adult self solidified, he became filled first with discomfort and, frankly, proceeding to the point of disgust for the Cluny style of Benedictine monasticism, because he saw it as too soft. And that which is soft, leads one away from ascesis and mortification in his view, and therefore opens up the distractions and the temptations. So we'll encounter Peter Damien again as we get in the chronology to the things that Pope Benedict mentioned, but I wanted you to have all that together, since Peter Damien is the first doctor of the Church in the second millennium. Okay, he was born in the reign of Pope John XVIII, who abdicated in June of 1009, after a reign of 5 years and 7 months. He spent the remainder of his life in the monastery attached to St. Paul outside the walls. He died sometime after of causes that have not been recorded. Pope 142 was a pope whose name, his baptismal name, was a form of Peter. So Pietro is Italian, Pietro de Pania. He was elected, again with the, at the prompting of the House Crescentii. He accepted election on the 31st of July, 1009. And as Pope 142, he did not keep his baptismal name, Peter. He reigned as Pope Sergius IV. During his reign, a development occurred within Islam that is going to be of importance to church history, well, and Islamic history too, because this is a step on the way to the Crusades, which began at the end of this century we're covering. So remember, nothing just happens. So there's a lot that went into this. So the change in Islam, initially he had nothing to do with it, but this change is going to be known in the West and added. So there'll be a series of incidents, so that when the last incident occurs, which we'll get to at the end of the century, then the crusading movement started. Okay, the change was since we last left Islam, the borders of Islam stabilized from Spain in the west to India in the east, and Islam had divided into three spheres politically. First, the Abbasid Sultan of Baghdad controlled what is now Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, and Jordan. The Fatimid Caliph of Cairo in Egypt controlled Egypt, Syria, the Holy Land, and Western Sinai and Western Arabia. These were Shia. Both of the Abbasids and the Fatimids were both Shiites, and they reigned that part of much of North Africa from 909 to 1171. So-called Fatimids because they claimed descent from Fatima, who was a daughter of Muhammad. And we met her, she married Ali, we met her in the section on Islam. The third were the Umayyad caliphs of Cordova, who controlled northwestern Africa and Spain. They were Sunni. All right, with that in mind. In 1005, Abu Ali Mansur al-Hakim bin Amir Allah became the sixth Fatimid Caliph in Egypt and began a persecution of Christians in 1009. He destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem on October 18th of that year. Most Christians in the West who heard of the destruction were outraged, but there was no one in Europe then capable of undertaking any kind of rescue mission to the Holy Land, because the Christians were too busy slaughtering each other. However, the incident destroying the Church of the Holy Sepulchre entered into the collective memory of the West and must be taken as in considering the multi-generational momentum that led to the crusading movement. In the year 1012, both Pope Sergius and the reigning Don of House Crescentii, Giovanni II, were assassinated on May 12th and May 18th, respectively. These actions were part of a coup d'etat carried out by the Tusculani family, the Theophylacte family, who were the Counts of Tuscany, hence the Tusculani. They took control of the papacy, the Holy See, the Papal States, away from House Crescentii. For a time. After Sergius was assassinated, the surviving Crescentii put forward Gregory, a guy named Gregory, as Pope, and the Theophylacts put forward Theophylact, who he happened to have that name. He was the son of the Count of Tusculum of Tuscany. This guy was still a layman, but was elected pope. But because the Tusculani won, they won the coup d'état. And he was rushed through all the necessary holy orders in sacrilegious haste. As Pope 143, he took the name Benedict VIII. His, he was consecrated as Pope after all of this on the 18th of May, 1012. His first order of business was dealing with the Crescenci survivors who had taken refuge in a mountain fortress. He was an accomplished warrior before election as Pope, so he personally led an expedition to slaughter the Crescenci in their mountains. After which, Pope Benedict VIII finally managed to get Henry II, the King of Germany, to visit Rome. In February of 1014, Pope Benedict anointed him Holy Roman Emperor. This is the second one. You remember, Henry II was already anointed, crowned in Milan by the Archbishop of Milan, but this is by the Pope in St. Peter's, like Charlemagne. So that's the justification for a second ceremony. And it was after Henry swore to protect the church from its enemies. Pope Benedict then personally led an army to restore papal control of Campagna, and he proved to be a very successful general and admiral. Recall, the island of Sardinia had functioned as a base for Saracen pirate raids for years, for 200 years now. In 1016, Pope Benedict organized a flotilla to eject them. After capturing some pirates and torturing them into revealing the location of their bases, Benedict's fleet made a nighttime raid and massacred the pirates. In 1020, Benedict visited Henry in Germany and personally dedicated Henry's new cathedral in Bomberg. On the 1st of August, 1022, on the way back, Benedict hosted a synod at Pavia, in which concubinage and priestly marriage were forbidden, and stipulated that the children of any such union were to be reduced to the status of serfdom. Now, this is a synod, and so it was not in itself binding on the universal church. But this August 1st, 1022, is a step that we can see into the papal magisterium, a step in the direction of mandating priestly celibacy, which, remember, at this point celibacy was imposed on monks, and of course those monks who became priests. But at this period, it was still the same discipline as in the East, that a married man could be ordained, but once ordained, an ordained man could not marry. So this is a step in reversing that, mandating celibacy, that only an unmarried, like a married man, could no longer be ordained, that moving in that direction. And also, because of the feudalism problem, the mention of concubinage, that's the old, I don't know if you need me to explain that, but essentially that's keeping a mistress. Or, common law marriage, I guess it would be called today. Or actual marriage, so both things were being attacked. Pope Benedict died on the 9th of April, 1024. His younger brother followed him as Pope 144. His baptismal name was Romanus, but as Pope he took the name John the 19th. He had no personal achievements of long-term importance. But during his reign, which was April 19th, 1024, through October 20th, 1032. During his reign, on the 13th of July, 1024, St. Henry II, the last Saxon ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, died without a surviving son. The customary bloodbath followed, which resulted in a new dynasty taking over Germany and producing Holy Roman emperors. This was the Salian dynasty, Salian. And during the reign of the Salians, church-state disputes are going to escalate to the point of explosion. So who are these people? Tribally, they were Isolan Salian Franks, whose ancestral lands were in the Duchy of Franconia. That, by this period, Franconia is the duchy. It encompassed both Bavaria and Swabia and other parts of southern Germany. When their direct line ended, the Salian Franks, when that ended with the death of Henry IV, whom we'll get to later, they were followed by the Hohenstaufen dynasty, the first ruler of which, Conrad III, was a grandson, but through a daughter, of the last Salian ruler, Henry IV. This successor, Hohenstaufen dynasty, ruled the Holy Roman Empire from 1138 to 1254. The Salians dynasty and the Hohenstaufen dynasty would involve themselves in the affairs of the papacy for reasons of feudalism, land and wealth, as well as dynastic considerations, meaning control of Italy as the cradle of their claims to be emperor. To a degree that was very harmful to the church, as we'll see. Yet another satanic attack, try to take the church out of the loop. And in some ways, I don't want to overstate it anachronistically, but in retrospect, it can't be ignored. In some ways, we can see a prefiguring of the Protestant schism, which began in Germany. The Protestant movement, the church-state disputes, eventually would culminate in that, in a division of Christendom, a division of Western Europe, which remains. The Catholic-Protestant rift remains. So keep all that in mind. Pope John the 19th died on the 20th of October, 1032. All right, now, the seminarians, I don't know where you are in your canon law courses, but this one's going to be an interesting canonical puzzle for you. Pope 145, Pope Benedict IX, appears on papal list 3 separate times because he was twice deposed and restored. But were the depositions valid? Were the depositions, or was he pressured into resigning? If he did actually resign, but it was under duress, is that valid or not? So keep your canonical background in mind. So this guy was, his name was also Theophylact. He was a son of Alberic III, who was the Count of Tuscany. So he was the son of the Count of Tuscany. As Pope, he took the name Benedict IX. The first reign, or the first appearance of Benedict IX on the papal list spanned the dates October 21st, 1032, through September of 1044, at which point he was removed by Crescenci, House Crescenci, action capitalizing on popular resentment of him personally as well as popular resentment of domination by the Tusculani, by the House Tusculani. At that point, Bishop John of Sabina, who was of the House Crescentii, became Pope, or Antipope, we'll see, Antipope, Sylvester III, from the 20th of January through the 10th of March, 1045. So I'll leave that hanging, because we have, the Holy Spirit, as all this satanic stuff is going on, the Holy Spirit does not sleep either. And so it's during the reign of this Pope Benedict IX, we meet another doctor of the Church, the second doctor of the Church of the second millennium, Saint Anselm. Saint Anselm was born. I'll read first. Pope Benedict XVI described Anselm with these very high words of praise. He wrote in part, quote, "Prayer, study, and governance. Three activities that were a feature of the life of the Saint Anselm of Aosta, also known as Anselm of Bec, also known as Anselm of Canterbury, because of the cities with which he was associated. A monk with an intense spiritual life, an excellent teacher of the youth, a theologian with an extraordinary capacity for speculation, a wise man of governance, and an intransigent defender of libertas ecclesiae, the church's freedom. Anselm is one of the eminent figures of the Middle Ages who was able to harmonize all these qualities, thanks to the profound mystical experience that always guided his thought and his action. St. Anselm was born in 1033 in Aosta, that's in northern Italy, the first child of a noble family. His father was a coarse man, dedicated to the pleasures of life, who squandered his possessions. On the other hand, Anselm's mother was a profoundly religious woman of high moral standing. It was she, his mother, who saw to the first human and religious formation of her son, whom she subsequently entrusted to the Benedictines at a priory in Aosta. Anselm, who since childhood, as his biographer recounts, imagined that the good Lord dwelled among the towering, snow-capped peaks of the Alps, dreamed one night that he had been invited to this splendid kingdom by God, who had a long and affable conversation with him, and then gave him to eat a very white bread roll. This dream left Anselm with the conviction that he was called to carry out a lofty mission. At the age of 15, he asked to be admitted to the Benedictine order, but his father brought the full force of his authority to bear against him and did not even give way when his son, seriously ill and feeling close to death, begged for the religious habit as a supreme comfort. After his recovery and the premature death of his mother, Anselm went through a period of moral dissipation. He neglected his studies and, consumed by earthly passions, grew deaf to God's call. He left home, began to wander through France in search of new experiences. 3 years later, having arrived in Normandy, he went to the Benedictine Abbey of Bec, attracted by the fame of Lanfranc of Pavia, the prior. For him, this was a providential meeting, crucial for the rest of his life. Under Lanfranc's guidance, Anselm energetically resumed his studies, and it was not long before he became not only the favorite pupil, but also the teacher's confidant. His monastic vocation was rekindled, and after an attentive evaluation, at the age of 27, he entered the monastic order and was ordained a priest. Asceticism and study unfolded new horizons before him, enabling him to rediscover, at a far higher level, the same familiarity with God which he had had as a child. When Lanfranc became abbot of Caen in 1063, Anselm, after barely 3 years of monastic life, was named prior of the monastery of Bec and teacher of the cloister school, showing his gift as a refined educator. He was not keen on authoritarian methods. He compared young people to small plants that develop better if they are not enclosed in greenhouses, and granted them a healthy freedom. He was very demanding with himself and with others in monastic observance, but rather than imposing his discipline, he strove to have it followed by persuasion. Upon the death of Abbot Hurlwyn, the founder of the Abbey of Bec, Anselm was unanimously elected to succeed him. It was February 1079. In the meantime, numerous monks had been summoned to Canterbury to bring to their brethren on the other side of the Channel the renewal that was being brought about on the continent. Their work was so well received that Lanfranc of Pavia, Abbot of Caen, became the new Archbishop of Canterbury. He asked Anselm to spend a certain period with him in order to instruct the monks and to help him in the difficult plight in which his ecclesiastical community had been left after the Norman conquest. Anselm's stay turned out to be very fruitful. He won such popularity and esteem that when Lanfranc died, he was chosen to succeed him in the Archiepiscopal See of Canterbury. He received his solemn episcopal consecration in December 1093. Anselm immediately became involved in a strenuous struggle for the Church's freedom, valiantly supporting the independence of the spiritual power from the temporal. Anselm defended the Church from undue interference by political authorities, especially King William Rufus and King Henry I, finding encouragement and support in the Roman pontiff, to whom he always showed courageous and cordial adherence. In 1103, this fidelity even cost him the bitterness of exile from his See of Canterbury. Moreover, it was only in 1106, when King Henry I renounced his right to the conferral of ecclesiastical offices, as well as to the collection of taxes and the confiscation of church properties, that Anselm could return to England, where he was festively welcomed by the clergy and the people. Thus the long battle he had fought with the weapons of perseverance, pride, and goodness ended happily. This holy archbishop, who roused such deep admiration around him wherever he went, dedicated the last years of his life to the moral formation of the clergy and to intellectual research into theological topics. He died on the 21st of April, 1109, accompanied by the words of the gospel proclaimed in Holy Mass that day, quote, "You are those who have continued with me in my trials. As my Father appointed a kingdom for me, so do I appoint for you, that you may eat and drink at my table in the kingdom." And that's a quote from Luke chapter 22. So it was that the dream of the mysterious banquet he had as a small boy at the very beginning of his spiritual journey found fulfillment. Jesus, who had invited him to sit at his table, welcomed Anselm upon his death into the eternal kingdom of the Father. I pray, O God, to know you, to love you, that I may rejoice in you. And if I cannot attain to full joy in this life, may I at least advance from day to day until that joy shall come to the full. Words of Anselm, Proslogion, chapter 14. This prayer enables us to understand the mystical soul of the great saint of the Middle Ages, the founder of scholastic theology, to whom Christian tradition has given the title Magnificent Doctor, because he fostered an intense desire to deepen his knowledge of the divine mysteries, but in the full awareness that the quest for God is never ending, at least on this earth. The clarity and logical rigor of his thought always aimed at raising the mind to contemplation of God. He states clearly that whoever intends to study theology cannot rely on his intelligence alone, but must cultivate at the same time a profound experience of faith. The theologian's activity, according to St. Anselm, thus develops in three stages: faith, a gift freely offered others, to be received with humility. Experience, which consists in incarnating God's Word in one's own daily life. And therefore, true knowledge, which is never the fruit of ascetic reasoning, but rather contemplative intuition. In this regard, his famous words remain more useful than ever, even today, for healthy theological research and for anyone who wishes to deepen his knowledge of the truths of faith. Quote, I do not understand, O Lord. I do not endeavor, O Lord, to penetrate your sublimity, for in no wise do I compare my understanding with that. But I long to understand, in some degree, your truth, which my heart believes and loves. For I do not seek to understand that I may believe, but I believe in order to understand. For this also I believe, that unless I believed, I should not understand. Okay, so to give some background for all of that, St. Anselm of Aosta Beck, Canterbury. All right. He had ecclesiastical associations with all three of those cities in different countries, Italy, France, England. He was born in the first, Aosta, that's in Piedmont, Italy, in 1003. That's northern Italy. His father, Gundulf, was a Lombard warrior. His mother, Ermenberga, was the daughter of a French Burgundian baron, who, because of the feudalism problem, which also eroded marriage, she was just given in marriage to Gundulf to cement a family alliance. At an early age, he talked about that, the religious experience by the age of 15. Anselm decided he wished to serve the church, serve God as a churchman. Now, his father did not prevent his mother from sending him to school at an abbey school, a Benedictine abbey school. But once Anselm wanted to become a monk, his father said he regarded church service to be effeminate. And he intimidated the local abbot into refusing Anselm's permission to join. So Anselm's mother comforted him until her death with her own religious practices. But once she died in 1060, he had nothing tying him to Italy. So he left Italy, traveled north. So we'll leave him traveling. As Pope Benedict said, it was 3 years of just aimless wandering. So now to catch up, to give some background and then bring them both together. In the year 1040, a Norman monk named Herluin, Herluin, established an abbey in Bec, Normandy, with himself as abbot. Herluin was born into one of those Norman families, and we talked about the origins of the Normans, who blurred the distinctions between church and war, such that Herluin was trained as a knight. Now, since churchmen were not supposed to use weapons, the good Herluin fought instead with hunting instruments. The axe, the spear, the bow. Well, the axe is a tool, so you could use that. The spear and the bow, that could be used as hunting. Those weren't necessarily just weapons like a sword. But he was as effective at killing as all the other Normans were. Curiously, though, this is another peculiarity among the Normans. Herluin, he was quite religious. He was genuinely had faith. And he was mature enough to recognize that he was not a spiritual leader. Yet he had trained enough soldiers to have the talent of judging young men, to know what kind of men they were going to grow into. So, in 1042, the good abbot Herluin recruited Lanfranc of Pavia to become Lanfranc of Bec. All right, Lanfranc, this is spelled Lanfranc. Born in Pavia, 1005, which also is in Lombardy. So Lanfranc and Anselm came from the same northern Italy background, geographically, as well as ethnically. They were both descended from the Lombards. So they spoke the same dialect, and they knew, even though they didn't know each other in Italy, they would eventually meet, and they had that commonality. Lanfranc had a different path than Anselm. As a young man, Lanfranc studied with a guild of lawyers in Bologna, who would later become incorporated into the Second Medieval University, which we'll get to. Lanfranc was a prodigy as a student and later a gifted teacher. After his education was complete, he left Italy, seeking his fortune in the world. He found employment in France, teaching at the cathedral school in Avranches. He was well regarded there, but as the years passed, he felt an inner void with the ways of the world. A sense of aimlessness, futility. He didn't hate what he was doing, but he just lost the sense that there was any real point to it. And this feeling, which later Carmelite spirituality, this will be called the desolation. It's never a pleasant feeling. But as later John of the Cross wrote, explained it, that sometimes there are different causes for the desolation. Sometimes it's a plateau, which can be seen properly as a good sign, because it means you've actually climbed part of the mountain. The ascent of Mount Carmel, so it means you've actually climbed part of the mountain. So it doesn't mean that what you've done previously is bad necessarily, but when you reach the plateau, it means that the sort of the incline of the mountain changes. So the way you climbed up to that plateau, you cannot continue to ascend in exactly the same way. So it's a call. If the desolation is brought about in this way, then it's a call to grow. So it can be a kick in our complacency. And sometimes, as in this case, such a kick in our complacency can be the sign of a vocation, of an ecclesiastical or monastic vocation, religious vocation. So he found himself searching too, just as Anselm. After searching, he encountered the warrior monk, the good abbot Herwin. 2 years after, Herwin founded and became the first abbot of the monastery of Bec. Herwin, despite his sanguinary hobby, he appreciated the value of learning, and he wanted his new abbey to be a success spiritually, as well as intellectually. So he convinced Lanfranc to join the new abbey as prior, by promising him free reign to create to be the capiscola, the head of the abbey school. Herwin abided; he kept his word. So he was a true knight in that sense. Abided by his promise, and he was usually not at the abbey anyway, because he was off. I shouldn't laugh, but it's just one of those things that, about the medieval period, that it taken in context, it makes perfect sense. This Herwin was descended from the Norman. It said that he was actually descended from Rollo the Viking, through one of Rollo's many sons, and so that synthesis of the Viking, ethos with French knighthood, produces this guy, who sees no problem. I mean, he's a killer. He's a trained killer and very good at it, but he's also very religious. Always kept his word. And that anyway, it's the Middle Ages. And the abbey, and so under the schola, the abbey schola under Lanfranc flourished, and it enjoyed the support of other Normans, patronage of other Normans, because of Herwin. He was a person of standing, among the Normans. As well as among the local French population, because they valued what Lanfranc was creating. So it was this monastery that had already been reset and upgraded under Lanfranc's guidance that Anselm visited, and in the course after wandering around, going from abbey to abbey, just looking, and that's as Pope Benedict described, that it was a life-changing moment for both of them. So Anselm found in Lanfranc a spiritual father, mentor, and Lanfranc found in Anselm a spiritual son and an heir, so to speak, and that Anselm would follow him twice, would follow him as prior and Beck, as well as Archbishop of Canterbury. So we'll meet Anselm again. Let's see, Pope. Oh, right. We started with the three, the triregno, the three reigns of Benedict IX. So the second reign of Benedict IX had came about in this way. By the 10th of April, 1045, House Tusculani managed to fight their way back to control of Rome and reinstall their guy, Benedict IX, in the Lateran, St. John Lateran, which is the cathedral of the Pope, in his capacity as Bishop of Rome. And remember, that's, those two go together. You can't be Pope without being Bishop of Rome. Meanwhile, the Crescenci Pope, Sylvester III, who had been Bishop of Sabina, so he got out, he escaped, he returned to Crescenci lands, and resumed his previous duties as Bishop of Sabina, where he remained until his death in October 1063. So since he was already, so canonically, since John of Sabina, who became Pope, or maybe not, Sylvester III, since John had already been ordained Bishop of Sabina before he became Pope, all of his sacramental actions as Pope were valid. All of his ordinations, confirmations were valid. Now, whether they're illicit or not, canonists can still argue about that. So, like later the Crescenci are going to say that when Benedict fled the first time, he actually had abdicated, in which case this next election would have been valid, unless that abdication was under duress. But it might have just been, okay, this isn't worth dying for, so I really do abdicate. But then Benedict came back. Now, both of these guys are pawns. It's really the houses, House Crescenci against House Tusculani. Just remember, the Middle Ages, this is not a free society. Children were not free. And even though these guys were men, they're still not free, because their elders in the family were also their feudal lords. So there was vassals. But anyway, Sylvester died. So the either Pope or anti-Pope Sylvester III died in October 1063, and Benedict IX was still alive. And so Tusculani were able to put Benedict back. So then there was no other person claiming to be Pope. So canonically, even if he did abdicate, then this is his second reign. But if he had not abdicated and just ran away to save his life, then this is just a continuation of his reign. But since the other guy is now deceased, then there's no more anti-pope in that sense. There's no more question. So the canonical questions date from the overlap when those two were still alive. But many are nullified because Sylvester III was already ordained a bishop. If he had been a layman at the time, and then you could consider his ordinations invalid, that would be another question. Okay, so time passed, and the House Crescenci hit back. They provoked another uprising against Pope Benedict IX, and this time he supposedly did abdicate. But again, was it under duress or not? On May 1st, 1045. The reason this one is more of a question is because, again, supposedly, when he abdicated this time, he also named his successor. He named his godfather. And I'm not making this up. I know you. I'm not making this. He named his godfather in the House Tusculani, the family. His godfather in the family. His name was Giovanni Gracianus, who became Pope Gregory VI, Pope 148. Now, this guy he's mixed because of a marriage. His parents married, so he was not pure Tusculani. His mother was Tusculani, but his father was of the house Pierleoni, which was allied, obviously, since there was the intermarriage, was allied with House Crescentii. So Gregory VI, it was appointed by his predecessor, Benedict IX, with which a pope does have the authority to do, on May 1st, 1045. Gregory VI was then arrested and allegedly deposed by German imperials serving Heinrich III, the King of Germany, an alleged Holy Roman Emperor. They deposed him officially, they claimed, on the charge of simony. Simony, named for Simon Magus in Acts of the Apostles, who tried to purchase, the sacramental power from the apostles, Peter and John, and Peter cursed him. So simony is the purchase of ecclesiastical office, and that's a constituent part of the feudalism. That's part of the feudalism problem. So they said simony renders his election invalid, and deposed him. He was arrested. He was kidnapped and sent as a prisoner to Germany, where he was kept in a dungeon, and then they just stopped feeding him. Or maybe they just slit his throat. But anyway, he died in 1047. Practically then, in practical terms, the papacy was pronounced vacant. And while the deposing him was invalid, and kidnapping him was criminal, and murdering him was criminal, once he was dead, then the papacy was, vacant. If Benedict IX's abdication and appointment of his godfather was valid. But if Benedict had done all of that under duress, then the appointment was invalid, and Benedict was still pope. But for Rome, since Benedict wasn't there at the time, in Rome, they assumed that a vacancy existed. So a new election was held, in which Siger, Archbishop of Bomberg, became Pope 149, depending on how we enumerate all of this canonically. As Pope, he took the name Clement II on Christmas Eve, 1046. And he, of course, was of the German faction, the German imperial faction. So he crowned Heinrich III and his wife, and crowned both of them imperially on Christmas Day. Remember, Charlemagne was the first initially crowned on Christmas Day. And also anointed Henry as Rex Germanorum, King of Germany, as well as Imperator, the Holy Roman Emperor. On the 5th of January, 1047, Pope Clement II hosted a synod in which the sin of simony was sharply condemned. And he decreed 40 days penance for anyone who was knowingly ordained by a bishop who had purchased his office by simony. Pope Clement II was a tall, vigorous, healthy man, yet he dropped dead on October the 9th, 1047. It was assumed that this was poison, administered by an assassin employed by House Tusculani. Which brings us to the third reign of Pope Benedict IX, or just the third installment of his single reign, depending on your canonical decision. After the sudden death of Pope Clement II, Benedict IX returned on a wave of anti-German, anti-imperial sentiment. He retook his cathedral, the Lateran, on the 8th of November, 1047. He remained there until the German imperial struck back. They sent troops to seize control of Rome on the 16th of July of the next year, 1048, driving Benedict into exile again, and this time he never returned. During this period, this either third papacy, either third reign or third installment of the reign of Benedict IX, something else happened in church history where we meet the Normans again. Remember, I told you when that was established, that synthesis of the Viking ethos with French knighthood that was going to produce things that are going to change history. And so here's another one. A Norman knight named Robert Guiscard. He was of the French house, or the Norman French house of de Hauteville. That's D-E, the particle of nobility, D-E, then Hauteville. So Robert, son of Tancred, house de Hauteville. Robert was hired by Greeks living in southern Italy to just hired him as the leader of a band of warriors, Norman mercenaries, to protect them from Saracen pirates. When Guiscard arrived in Italy in 1047 with his men, he couldn't believe the opportunity presented for people like him who were well armed. He and his men were well armed and well trained, and there was no government in southern Italy. It was total anarchy. So this is the southern Italian cities were trying the federati strategy, and essentially, again, because that always had such stellar results. They were hiring these guys to protect them. Well, Guiscard cheerfully turned on them, on the Italian Greeks who had hired him, and he used his Norman knights to simply conquer southern Italy for themselves. He recognized the Saracen presence in Sicily, which is an island, but right across from southern Italy, as a threat to his domains. So he led his Normans over to Sicily, where they began enthusiastically slaughtering Muslims until they had taken control of the island. Robert Guiscard then sought amusement in creating titles for himself and his followers. He started small, naming himself Duke of Apulia, then Duke of Calabria, then Duke of Amalfi. But then he thought, why stop there? This was the result of this hobby was the creation of the Norman Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, as it was called, with one Sicily being the island of Sicily, and the other being the Kingdom of Naples, which is on the mainland, a port on the mainland of southwestern Italy. He established a new dynasty that entered into the affairs of the church for a number of reasons, many connected to feudalism, as we'll see. So this is the House de Hauteville, yet another dynasty, another house that we're dealing with. So they can enter history in a number of ways. One was immediately apparent with the conquest of Sicily in 1047. Remember, the Sicily had descendants of the old Romans, the old imperials, so we would think of as Italian, but they also had a multi-century presence of Greeks, who in some cases just remained intermarried among themselves, but in other cases intermarried with the old imperials. And at this point, over 2 centuries of Muslim presence, because the Saracens had set up bases in Sicily and stayed there for 2 centuries. This made of Sicily a multicultural environment. Once the Normans conquered it, it brings this multicultural environment together under a single political entity. It's just as the old Roman Empire had. Now, this obviously was smaller, but similar in terms of cultural dynamics, the cultural anthropology we talked about in the intro to the very first course you had with me, Patristics. Naples, Sicily, had populations of Muslims, Greeks, Italians, and now Norman French. So religiously, it had in the population Sunni Muslims, Shiite Muslims, Christian Greek Orthodox, Christian Greek Monophysites, and some of those were Egyptian, Coptic Egyptians, and Latin Roman Catholics. So diffusion synthesis, syncretism occurred in this multicultural environment. Significant for Western intellectual development, as this was the first time that a substantial Islamic population came under the control of Catholic rulers, thereby facilitating transport of translations of Arabic works or Greek works into Latin, or Arabic translations of Greek originals into Latin. This was crucial to the development of scholasticism and universities in the High Medieval period, which is going to start at the end of this century, because the Muslims had more access to more surviving texts of Aristotle than had existed in the West, because the Muslims had conquered so much of the Byzantine East. On the 18th of July, 1048, one day after the German imperials drove Benedict IX from the Holy See for the end of his third installment as Pope, a guy named Poppo, Poppo, he was the Bishop of Brixen in present-day Austrian Tyrol. That's the Alpine Austria, southern Austria. He was the favorite of the German king and emperor Heinrich III. He was elected Pope 151. As Pope, he took the name Damasus, the second one to have that name. He survived for 23 days as Pope, dying suddenly on the 9th of August, 1048. He was followed as Pope 152 by the first true reforming Pope of the Second Christian Millennium. And this is where we meet again the Cluny movement, which we introduced in the 10th century unit, and I promise we meet it again. It would be the first international reforming movement in the history of the church, and it's because of this. So they finally, after all this, the papacy had been taken out of the loop for generations because of all these dynastic, warring houses, but the spirit was still there. And the Cluny reform had been spreading generation after generation, more houses, and more importantly, more guys trained with that ethos who went and taught others. And those people grew up with that ethos and taught others. And then it kept spreading. So now, with Pope Leo IX, the Cluny-style reformers, for the first time, get control of the papacy, away from all these, the political, military types who were just using it as a dynastic trophy. Okay, so who was this guy? Pope 152, and he's now recognized as a saint, Saint Leo IX. He was born into a noble family in Alsace, Old Lotharingia. You remember that's between France and Germany. Baptized with the name Bruno. And his family sent him into the church, so it seemed like it would be another life of the feudalism problem. But remember, when I introduced feudalism, I said that there are different reactions. There's some who would give in to the temptations, not care about, that their ordination or their monastic life and just live the way they wanted. But there are others who would embrace it. And he's one who did. Early in life, he became a canon at the Cathedral of Toul, that's Toul, and was a regular at the German royal court. On the 9th of September, 1027, Bruno became Bishop of Toul and immediately showed his proclivities by aggressively reforming his diocese according to the Cluny model. Now, he never studied at the mother house of Cluny, but he was obviously taught by people who had been either there or at some other Cluny house. Prefiguring his later concerns as Pope, Bishop Bruno focused on raising the moral standards of the clergy to combat the feudalism drift, believing that integrity of life was directly proportionate to their credibility, and that their credibility was directly proportionate to their potential effectiveness as clerics. Bishop Bruno networked with all the leading reformers of the day. who were trying to do the same thing on the on the small scale, the local scale, because that's as much as they could do. When Pope Damasus II died, the Emperor Heinrich III nominated Bruno as the next pope. He and the German faction in Rome successfully managed to accomplish that. He chose the name Leo deliberately, recalling the strength and resolve of some of the best popes from antiquity. He was thus crowned Pope Leo IX on the 12th of February, 1049. His first order of business was assembling a team of men trained in Cluny monasteries, which was still the breeding ground for Reformed theology. The men he recruited would shape church history for the next generation. Or two, really, because some lived long. One, named Hildebrand, would later become Pope Gregory VII. Another, Frederick of Liège, later become Pope Stephen IX. Hugh, or Humbert, well, we're going to meet him. It was Humbert of Moyen-Mortier, but when he became Pope, excuse me. All right, sorry about that. That was the principal at the school here in the parish. We have to talk because we have another hurricane coming towards us. And this is October 27th. Yet another hurricane. All right. So he assembled his team. Hildebrand, later Pope. Frederick of Liège, also later Pope. Hugh Humbert Moyen-Mortier, also known as Hugh Candidus, who later became a cardinal. And he recruited Abbot Hugh, another Hugh, but a different one. This was Abbot Hugh of Cluny. And the Archbishop of Tours, his name was Alinard, as well as St. Peter Damien, whom we've already met. And he appointed him Cardinal Bishop of Ostia. Only 6 weeks after his election, Pope Leo summoned a synod to meet in Rome, which met from April 9th through April 15th, 1049, at which Leo ordered deposed any bishop, abbot, or priest who directly purchased his position, meaning through simony, and forbade them to ever be ordained. So it was declared, canonically, he was declaring their ordination invalid. That's a huge step. Not just illicit, but invalid. He then pressured clergy, high and low, to expel their concubines and wives, along with any children of the union. Now, this was deemed excessively harsh by many, as some of these women had few options open to them, and clerical marriage had been accepted for centuries. But Pope Leo was adamant that only extreme measures could cleanse the church of corruption, and he saw, as a former monk, monks always had to abide by celibacy, he saw celibacy as a centerpiece of this reform plan. Also, he had biblical precedent. The book of Ezra, chapters 9 and 10. Ezra forced Israelites who married pagans to put aside any of their wives and children from such unions, under penalty of confiscation of their property and exile from the Holy Land. Ezra chapters 9 and 10. All right. In the year 1050, St. Peter Damien wrote a letter to Pope Leo, which, an open letter, kind of, letter, that's a convention. It was a letter form, but it was meant to be copied and circulated. And it shocked the medieval world, and it became the subject of conversation for the generation. It was titled The Book of Gomorrah. It was a scathing, blood-curdling denunciation of moral vices among the clergy and monastics of the day, in the course of which It is the first theological tract that treats the subject of homosexuality theologically since the New Testament. Since, anyway, background scriptural references. The book of Genesis, chapter 19, is part of the Sodom and Gomorrah story. St. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 1, verses 26 to 27, when explaining the Sodom and Gomorrah, the sin. Actually, I'm not gonna read it. Just let you can read that yourself. Also, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 9, and 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 20. The current teaching of the Church on this issue of homosexuality is treated in the Catechism, numbers 2357 through 2359. But that is not the only. So the Book of Gomorrah, I'm not going to read excerpts as I have from other things, in part because I want this to be a family-friendly channel, and he gets a little too detailed to meet that criteria. In other words, it's not rated G or even PG, the way he describes the sins, but it's all part of the feudalism problem. As we talked about this, these, especially in the monasteries and convents, where these kids are just thrown, as children, they're just thrown into these places without a genuine vocation, with other people who did not have a genuine vocation. And so this kind of stuff's going to happen. But that was not the only sin he denounced in the Book of Gomorrah. As many vices he covers, sins of the flesh, so to speak, to describe it politely, which falls under the moral theological category of concupiscence. So that I will talk about to get the theological content. Concupiscence is derived from the Latin verb, and its infinitive form, cupere, means to desire. So the prefix, the con, means, concupiscence means with desire. The Catechism treats it specifically in numbers 25:14 through 25:16. So just the desire is not sinful. I mean, we desire to go to heaven. That's not sinful. So Peter Damien in the Book of Gomorrah interpreted concupiscence as follows: as seeking to prolong pleasure beyond what was natural. In so doing, it separated pleasure from purpose. This separation opened up a moral and spiritual abyss from which the temptation to the sin of lust emerged. And that's what Peter Damien spent so much of the Book of Gomorrah denouncing, that that there were so many had given in to this sin because they had no real vocation. And back to the feudalism problem. So for him, the various sinful acts he denounced, and they were not just homosexual acts, there were many other acts which I'm not going to describe. He regarded them as having no purpose other than pleasure for the self. If these actions succeeded in providing pleasure for the self, then concupiscence drove that tempted soul to repeat the experience, to prolong the pleasure, purposeless pleasure. He regarded the temptation to attend to the self before attending to the faith as the root of all spiritual failures, not just the sexual offenses that he was talking about so much. And that's really all I'm going to say about this. It's in his collection of letters. It's in the 30s. I think it's letter 38, but it's also, because it was so long and because of its content, it's also called the Book of Gomorrah. So I'll leave you with lust is defined by the Church in the Catechism, number 2351. Disordered lust as adversely affecting the sacrament of matrimony is discussed in the Catechism, numbers 1607 through 1608. And by way of correction, chastity is discussed in number 2346. And the issue of someone who is single, but not of their own choosing. In other words, someone who really does want to be married correctly, wants to have a family correctly and live a chaste married life, but cannot for some reason. That also is treated in the Catechism, number 1658. So I'm going to leave it there and go back to the chronology. St. Peter Damien wrote that in 1050. In March of 1051, the city of Benevento in southern Italy sent a delegation to Pope Leo begging him to save them from the Normans. Remember Robert Guiscard? And this was the first real mistake in his reign. He was trying to fix things, and he was fixing some things, theologically, ecclesially. But remember, the Papal State, because the Papal State existed, and they regarded it as essential to maintaining the independence of the Holy See, then that drew the Church into political, commercial, military situations that were not healthy for the Church to become involved in. But he did. So he recruited 700 Swabian mercenaries, as well as a group of 2,000 Italian peasants, to form a makeshift militia. And he thought that was going to take care of Norman knights in southern Italy. Now, to be fair to him, he had never seen Norman knights in battle. So while Leo and his force were marching south, the Normans engaged them on the 17th of June, 1053, at Fortare River in Apulia, and effortlessly slaughtered the entire papal force and captured the Pope. Now, Guiscard was rather detached about the whole thing. He didn't take it personally. He did not harm the Pope, but he did keep the Pope incarcerated in one of his stolen Italian palaces. Apart from being deprived of, freedom to leave, Leo was well treated. He was given several rooms to stay in. He was not thrown in a dungeon. He was kept well fed. He was allowed visitors. He was allowed to correspond. And it was through correspondence that Leo witnessed the most momentous event of his reign in terms of long-term history, and a defining moment for the history of the Church, East and West. And that is the Great Schism, the schism between Roman Catholic and Greek Orthodox. Okay, the Byzantine Greeks were still claiming southern Italy as Greek territory. They heard muddled reports of the Pope and the Normans, which they decided to interpret as the Pope attempting to conquer southern Italy for himself, which means they thought the Pope was trying to steal southern Italy from them, even though they exercised no real control over it. So based on that complete, ridiculous misunderstanding, in retaliation, the 102nd Patriarch of Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, named Michael Cerularius. This is anglicized. It's Cerularius. In retaliation, he banned the practice of Latin Rite Christianity in Greek territory in August of 1053. In practice, this affected only a small number of Latins engaged in trade in Constantinople and other eastern cities. But the public affront demanded a papal response, especially since it was based on something that didn't exist. It was based on a fantasy misinterpretation. But Leo IX was incarcerated by the Normans. Now, he did have freedom to correspond, but he couldn't, he had to assume that all of his correspondence was going to be read. Probably not, because the Normans didn't care, but, so Leo dispatched a papal legate to the east to negotiate a solution. He chose a cardinal who was devoted to him personally, and who was a fanatic reformer along the Cluny style, whom I mentioned earlier, Humbert of Moyen-Mortier, or Hugh of Candida. Humbert left in January of 1054. Leo then collapsed internally. He collapsed, as we call it, a deep depression. That he fell into, and in retrospect, he never recovered. He had a coffin made for himself. He moved it into his bedroom, and he was sleeping next to the coffin, praying for death. The Normans were a superstitious people, because they were not that far from their Viking pagan heritage. So Robert Guiscard then allowed Leo to return to Rome. Leo brought his coffin with him and set it up in St. Peter's Basilica, where he continued to sleep next to it. So it was convenience, so he was praying to die. He hoped he would die. And then for the people who would find his dead body, then they could just lift him and put him in the coffin. That's why he was doing it that way. Meanwhile, in the east, Cardinal Humbert arrived in Constantinople. He and Patriarch Michael took an instant dislike to each other. It's just one of those things, just like a chemical thing or chemical reaction, a personality thing. They despised each other. First meeting, they despised each other. Their discussion of the issues of sovereignty over southern Italy and practice of the Latin Rite in the East soon descended to the level of screaming and mutual insults. While they were meeting, the meeting would break up, then they would get back together, then they would just went on like that. While that was going on, news arrived that Pope Leo finally received his wish. He died on the 19th of April, 1054. Now, canonically, you seminarians, you know what happens. So Hugh is appointed papal legate. A legate is one who exercises authority in the name of another, in this case the Pope. When the Pope died, then his legatine authority evaporated. He was still a cardinal, he was still ordained, so he still had that ecclesial role, but he was no longer empowered to represent the Holy See. So what should have happened then is, canonically, and just prudentially, even if there weren't these fights going on, just prudentially, it should have just ended. The meeting should have ended. And either he personally returned to Rome. Now, he wouldn't make it back in time for the election, even though he was a cardinal, but either he personally returned to Rome, or if he felt his health couldn't do it, then at least send a messenger back to Rome to get instructions from the next pope. And that's not what happened. So April 19th, Leo died. But the discussions continued, and the screaming continued. The tension between Cardinal Humbert and Patriarch Michael escalated until 3 p.m. on the 16th of July, 1054. Cardinal Humbert, accompanied by 2 witnesses, stalked into Hagia Sophia Church, the Church of the Holy Wisdom, and laid a document excommunicating Patriarch Michael, laid it on the high altar. They then left and returned to Rome. The Great Schism between East and West is dated from this moment. July 16th, 1054, 3 p.m. It has remained unhealed, at least in an enduring way. The two times later, once in the late Middle Ages and another time during the Renaissance, there were negotiations that technically ended the schism briefly, but it never lasted. So in reality, the schism endures to this day. Ridiculous, isn't it? Yes. The actual event is trivial, but taken in context, it was clearly the culmination of growing estrangement between East and West, accentuated by cultural, linguistic, liturgical differences, ethnic hatred, compounded by resentment felt by the Greeks for the loss of what they regarded as the western half of the empire, compounded by they never forgot or forgave the papacy for crowning Charlemagne as Holy Roman Emperor, or for accepting the former Exarchate of Ravenna as a donation from King Pepin. Now, the words of Patriarch Michael have survived. He wrote a letter in the same month after the event to the Patriarch of Antioch, whose name was Peter. Wrote this to him in July of 1054. And from this, we can see that, you remember, as I said, whenever there's an inordinate amount of emotion expressed, the issue's always something else. And in this case, since the event that the Greeks, the trigger event, never actually happened, that Leo was not trying to conquer southern Italy for himself, but in fact was trying to rescue southern Italy from the Normans. So all this emotion, it was really underneath it. And conveniently, Patriarch Michael lets us know some of that, and lets us see that he really just hated Latins. And the feeling was reciprocated. I'm not blaming the Greeks totally for this. I mean, the Latins hated the Greeks too, especially Bomberg. Okay, this is an excerpt. It's too long to read all, but I'll read it. And this is enough to see just how this guy felt about the West. So skipping down, in later editions, it's been enumerated into sections for convenience. So this, I'm beginning at section 9 of the letter. The words of Patriarch Michael to Patriarch Peter, quote, "Now a rumor has reached our ears that the Pope is commemorated in the diptychs, not only by your perfection, but also by the bishops of Alexandria and Jerusalem." Okay, the diptychs, think like at Mass, we have the prayers of the faithful. And, we typically, sometimes those prayers are changed based on the liturgical season. Well, in the East, they had regular prayers, the petitions, so to speak, and they were listed on the diptychs, these two panels, in the church. So when they offered up prayers, they could also say for all of, like everything on the diptychs, and just that would all be subsumed. Well, typically, when the Rome and Constantinople were in union, having the Patriarch of Rome, from their perspective, the Pope, on the diptychs was just a normal thing. But now, after the schism, from the Greek perspective, it shouldn't be there. All right, so that's what he's referring to. It's a rebuke, so to speak, saying, well, I've heard, even after we split, after the West has excommunicated me, you're still praying for them. So picking up with Patriarch Michael's words, "I would not think that such ignorance could exist, especially, above all others, in your incomparable virtue. For you know that from the 6th Holy and Ecumenical Council to the present, the commemoration of the Pope has been excised from the sacred diptychs of our holy churches. This is because the Pope at that time, Vigilius, did not want to come to that council, nor to anathematize what Theodoret wrote against the Orthodox faith and against the 12 chapters of St. Cyril, or the letter of Ibis." Now, this is this is centuries old conflict. So he's pretending that conflict was never resolved. So it's, as we've seen, there were multiple schisms between East and West. So with this one, he's going back, to another famous one and pretending that it had never been resolved. "And from then until now, the Pope has been cut off from our holy and Catholic Church." Now, that's not true. "For this reason, the rumor that patriarchs are commemorating the Pope is wholly incredible to us, not so much concerning the patriarchs of Jerusalem and Alexandria as concerning your wide wisdom and singular prudence." Section 10. "Moreover, we have also heard that the two aforementioned bishops not only accept people who partake of the unleavened bread in the Eucharist, but also themselves celebrate the divine mystery with unleavened bread. Okay, so here's another thing between East and West. The the Mass, Catholics, the host is unleavened bread. Now, we do that because the first Mass was the Last Supper. And the Last Supper was a Passover meal. And at the Passover meal, they eat unleavened bread, the bread of haste, recalling the first Passover, which was a meal prepared in haste. And that's recorded in Exodus chapter 12. Well, the Greeks, the Byzantines, the Orthodox, as we'll see here, they regard that as Judaizing. They regarded Catholics as Judaizing. So their bread is leaven. It's not unleavened wafers, it's leaven. Because they say that's for the new covenant. That yes, the Last Supper was a Passover meal of the old covenant, but it was also the Mass of the new covenant. So they add the leaven just because it's not identical. And the leaven, to represent the resurrection, like the new covenant. So that's another problem that they have with the Latins, that we do Mass with unleavened bread. Continuing the quote. Since we have no one at hand whom we might question about them in this matter, and since we cannot otherwise trust other people with it, we are entrusting the whole of the investigation to your holiness, so that when you have examined the matter thoroughly, you may let our mediocrity know. And section 10 goes on and on like that for a while. So next, section 11. Scleros, the most illustrious Duke of Antioch, has given us a copy of your letter to the Bishop of Aquila. When we read this, we found that it treated, for the most part, only of unleavened bread, omitting the other Roman errors, which are much more serious. If perhaps our mediocrity had written in this way to your holiness what we wrote to Scleros concerning these things, still we have never explained any of these to the Pope himself, or to any of his bishops, except for the letter of which we are now sending you a copy. For it seems from their letters and deeds that they are wholly lovers of falsehood and meddlers. But you know very well that the Romans are not spitted on only one pike, the one regarding unleavened bread, which is clearly known to all, but on many and various ones. On account of the following, it is necessary to avoid them. Section 12. Their Judaizing practices are as follows. The aforementioned accusation, along with eating the meat of beasts that has been strangled, shaving, observing the Sabbath, eating unclean meats, monks eating pork fat, and all the skin, right down to the meat, behaving in the same manner in the first week of Lent, cheese fair week, as in the week before, eating meat on Wednesday and cheese and eggs on Friday, but fasting all day on the Sabbath. Beyond these Judaizing practices, such things as the following are also true. Reasoning badly and dangerously. They have made some sort of addition to the Holy Creed, so that it is as follows, quote, and in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father and the Son, end quote. And in the divine service they intone, quote, one holy, one Lord, Jesus Christ, in the glory of God the Father, with the Holy Spirit, end quote. Section 13. They forbid the marriage of priests. That is, those who have wives cannot take up the dignity of priesthood, but those who wish to be priests must be unyoked. Two brothers are allowed to marry two sisters. During the liturgy, at the time for taking communion, one of the celebrants eats the unleavened bread, and then he kisses the others. Their bishops wear rings on their hands. And if indeed they took their churches as brides, and they say that they wear the ring as a pledge. Bishops going forth to battle stain their hands with blood, killing and being killed. As many have reported to us, they perform holy baptism by baptizing the candidates with only one immersion, invoking the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Also, they fill the mouths of the baptized with salt, wrongly receiving the apostolic saying which reads, "A little leaven leavens the whole loaf." They have written it down thus, "A little leaven corrupts the whole loaf." Thus they try, through this little occasion of a word, to set aside the yeast which raises the unleavened bread. Skipping down, section 14. They do not adore the relics of the saints. Some of them do not venerate icons either. They accept neither our fathers, teachers, and high priests, Gregory the theologian, Basil the Great, the divine Chrysostom, along with other saints whom they enumerate, nor any of their teaching. They do also other things, which it would be a great work to enumerate one by one. Therefore, if they live in such a way, and enfeebled by such customs, dare these things, which are obviously lawless, forbidden, and abominable, then will any right-thinking person consider that they are at all to be included in the category of the orthodox? I think not. But let those who declare that they think rightly, while acting in this way, take their part. But let us never envy them their concord and consent. Let us not be so insane. Let us not utterly take leave of our senses. Section 15. We have related these things briefly, so that your perfection, being able to know the practices of these men, might not think that they err only in the matter of the unleavened bread, just as we ourselves have thus far understood. And so that, recognizing also their extraordinary inferiority, you might reckon them with those whom they deserve. But more grave and more insupportable than all of these, that which also displays most clearly their dementia, is the following. They say that they will not travel here, so that they might be taught or hold discussions, but rather for teaching and persuading us to hold their doctrines. These things they say also with overweening arrogance and impudence. Okay. So he just really had an axe to grind. All right, so some of this is bogus. Some of it's true. The West does use the unleavened bread because, that's what Jesus did at the Last Supper. Let's see, this other stuff, Judaizing practice, eating the meats of beasts. Okay, so that the monks in the East were typically, once they became monks, they were just vegetarians. They just abstained from meat forever. And also during Lent, the Orthodox abstained from meat for the entirety of Lent, not just on the Friday, not just Ash Wednesday and the Fridays of Lent. The first week of Lent, Cheese Fair week, that's actually a thing. They did not, especially at this period, did not enumerate Lent the same way the West did. So whereas we think of Lent as started on Ash Wednesday, for them it did not. So the week before that, the week before Lent, was like Mardi Gras Carnival. That's your last chance to party. So Cheese Fair week, that was let's see, I have the actual word. Maslenitsa, Butter Week, Pancake Week, Cheese Fair Week. It was a week of celebration before the penance of Lent. And cheese and eggs on Friday. Okay, so for them, so they abstained. They abstained from meat for all of Lent, but then each Friday was a fast day. So that's why he's complaining about the cheese and eggs. Fasted on the Sabbath. And then he's Judaizing, the things they do on the Sabbath. So he's referring to the Jewish Sabbath, so he's wrong there, which is Saturday. So that there was no practice in the West of doing that on Saturday. So he misunderstood something. Now the big one, the filioque. Remember in the section on Saint Isidore of Seville, when his older brother Saint Leander secured the conversion of the Visigoths in Spain at the Third Council of Toledo, in Canon 2, Saint Leander wrote out the creed in Latin so that they knew what they were pledging to. When he got to the point, instead of in the original Greek, it read the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father through the Son. Instead, because they were Arians, previously they were Arian heretics who had a subordinationist ecclesiology, Christology, Trinitarian theology. Instead, in Latin, he wrote it, the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. So, in Latin, filioque, ex patre filioque procedevit. So, proceeds from the Holy Father. So, the filioque clause, that's so he's right there. In the West, they were doing that, and it was not changed by an ecumenical council. And that's an issue. So he's right there. I mean, now he's not disputing the theology necessarily. So the Byzantines, they had two schools of thought on that. Some did not dispute the theological statement that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, but they did dispute the way it was done. So that the Creed, Nicaea, Constantinople, that creed was promulgated at ecumenical councils, so that if there was going to be a change, it should also be at an ecumenical council. Whereas there were others in the East who also disputed the theological statement and just adhere to the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father through the Son. Forbid the marriage of priest, ironically, that's something that had just started, as we saw. Not that... Well, maybe not in his. Yeah, it could be in his lifetime, because the first was 1022, and this is 1054, so it could have been in his lifetime. Those who have wives cannot be married, and he's referring to this, which is also true, that those who wish to be priests must be unyoked. That means he's referring to Pope Leo making those priests who were married give up their wives and children if they wanted to stay priests. The two brothers are allowed to marry two sisters. That, yes, with a dispensation, that could be allowed. Bishops wearing rings, yes. We saw that the first one recorded to do that was St. Arnulf of Metz. So yes, the bishops in the West did do that, which he doesn't like. The bishops in the East did not. Bishops going forth into battle, stain their hands with blood, killing and being killed. Well, yeah, I'm sorry. He's right there. There's not all of them, but some. Like the good Abbot Hurlwin. He wasn't a bishop, but he was an abbot. And he certainly enthusiastically engaged in it. Okay. When he says in section 14, they do not adore the relics of the saints, that's not true. I don't know where he got that from. Some do not venerate icons either. Typically, Western art developed more statues, rather than icons. So it's not that the West rejected icons, the sacred art developed in a different way. This rejecting Gregory Nazianzus, Basil the Great, Chrysostom, I don't know where he got that. They've never been rejected in the West. Okay, so he was mad about a lot of stuff. Some of it was based in fact, others were not. And he just wasn't disposed to talk it through, to work it out. So the schism endures. As we said, Pope Leo IX died on the 10th of April, 1054. So we'll pause there. There's the schism. That's it's a dark thing, and it brings us, and we're halfway through the century. So we'll pause there, and we'll pick up next time with Pope 153, Victor II. For the moment, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.